This is an RNZ podcast.
This is Mediawatch. I'm Colin Peacock. This week we look at the results of the biggest annual survey of New Zealanders' trust in news, which also revealed much more about how Kiwis really feel about our news media these days.
We have to hold divisive forces accountable. Pull your ad dollars from platforms that spread disinformation. Don't be afraid. We have to help repair the societal fabric. We have to stand strong against political pressure. Do right, and action drives trust. Thank you very much. Thorough.
That was Richard Edelman, the CEO of the international PR company Edelman, which every year since the turn of the millennium has surveyed trust in institutions, governments, services and businesses in countries all over the world. And in almost all of them, it's recorded annual declines of trust in all sources of news and information in recent years. And it was the same again this year in 16 out of the 27 countries they survey, though it was up in 6 of them, including Mexico, the UK, France and, surprisingly, the US. And our former Prime Minister Helen Clark was also on hand at that announcement back in January to give a view from here.
I think to a large extent in New Zealand we've kept it, but you can feel it fraying. You can feel the influences of the polarisation, for example, out of the US, which plays in everybody's media, and how that's putting new pressures on as well. So I think keeping that ability to talk across political lines, to find what we have in common. What's our shared interest, I think. And I think that also applies geopolitically. There's not necessarily a lot of shared values, but we do have a lot of common interests. Yep. And we need to focus on how we address that.
Now, as it happens, New Zealand isn't among the countries that Edelman actually surveys for trust, though last year a survey by a local affiliate of Edelman, the PR company Acumen, found that trust in media here had dropped to just 41%, and that's well below Edelman's global average of 50%. And a majority of Kiwis also considered the media here a divisive force in our society, according to that survey. Bummer. But while that alarming result was reported by several media outlets at the time, including RNZ, the Acumen report actually told a different story on closer inspection. It said that trust in all media actually rose each year from 2017, and 58% of people surveyed chose traditional news media as a trusted source, and that's a greater proportion than people in the US, Japan or Australia. And the fine print from Acumen said that question about divisiveness was only put to about half of the sample, and the sample size of the survey wasn't even in the report. Hard to have too much trust in that. Now, since 2020, the most comprehensive annual survey of New Zealanders' trust in news has been carried out by the Centre for Journalism, Media and Democracy at the Auckland University of Technology, which uses the marketing company Horizon Research for the data and uses as a template for that a survey of 46 other countries by the international news agency Reuters. Now, the first time out, more than half of the respondents here said they can trust most of the news most of the time, and almost 2/3 trusted the news they personally consumed back in 2019. And people here were more sceptical than those in many other countries about news on social media and through online search engines. But since then, New Zealand's had lockdowns, anti-government and anti-COVID control protests, and more misinformation online, and also many claims that our media are corrupt or compromised, or both, because of increased government funding. Individual journalists and media outlets have also been targeted by trolls and critics. Now, last year's AUT Trust in News survey found that just 45% of us were prepared to say we trust the news most of the time. And in this year's survey, fresh out this week, it's fallen again to just 42%. So this week I asked the lead authors of the report, AUT's Dr. Greg Treadwell and Dr. Miriam Elinati, is it time to worry?
Well, it is worrying because this is the trend that we see that is continuing, and you start to wonder that where the bottom is. So we used to be the one of the high, or one of the compared to the Reuters survey, we were sitting above the other comparable countries, and now we are at the same level. So that trust gap internationally has disappeared. Of course, it's a worry for the democracy and journalism and news, and yeah.
And Greg, you did point out that trust in news people themselves actually consumed rather than just general overall news. That has actually increased slightly in this survey. However, That was around 62%, I think, back in 2020. So 4 years on, that's come down by about the same margin, by sort of 9% over the 4 years as the fall recorded in trust for general news overall.
Yeah, there's a slight uptick, but you're quite right, Colin. The thing to look at is the overall trend, and that's down as well. So the difference between people's views of the news generally and the views of the news that they pick out of the melee of news, the stuff they choose themselves, which we can assume they choose because they find it more trustworthy, and that is going down as well. So that means even the stuff we like, New Zealanders are finding less trustworthy. Whatever news you're talking about, it's falling rapidly, and we're now at 42% in terms of general trust in news, which is the equivalent of the sort of international average, whereas, as Maria was saying just before, we were higher. That gap is now gone, so it's actually been falling faster in New Zealand than other countries.
Well, people will, at various news organisations, including this one, will be looking at the individual scores. So trust for RNZ falling 14.5% on last year. Whakaata Māori Television 14.3%, News Talk ZB 14%. That looks like a trend. But then again, you look at it, there are smaller brands like interest.co.nz, even Crux, which is news for Queenstown and Southern Lakes area. I mean, the survey must be picking up fewer people know and are aware of those smaller brands. So should we take it absolutely literally that these double-digit falls, which sound bad for perhaps those bigger organisations, aren't necessarily... I mean, we're talking about a fraction of a sample here, so maybe we shouldn't get too concerned about that?
We take out, for example, the people who don't know the brand. They are excluded from those figures. So it's really difficult to say because, of course, these are the smaller ones are smaller. They have a smaller audiences than the big ones like Radio New Zealand or News Talk ZB. Of course, you have seen Radio New Zealand is still leading the trust tables with this year together with the TVNZ and Otago Daily Times.
I think there is some unevenness here, and this is, of course, a self-reported trust level. We ask people, do you trust the news? And they tell us how they feel about things at that moment. And we think that the fall in trust in news is a very complex thing. And while we think there are things that newsrooms can do to regain some of the lost trust in audiences, there are other things intersecting here. So, I mean, for example, RNZ's, somewhat surprisingly large fall, while still being a national leader, is RNZ's an institution, isn't it? And as we, in a sense, and in people's minds, it's a government institution of sorts. And as we sort of are surmising, the fall in trust in news is connected in ways to the fall in trust in all social institutions. And if you go through a pandemic, if you go through a cyclone, if you go through all the things that New Zealand's been through, emotionally you want to take it out on someone. And the government is so there are these kind of issues that are tied up with trust as well. And it's a very difficult thing to unpick. And the surveys that we're doing at the moment, we're working in the background at a much more sort of nuanced level. But the surveys are sort of bold facts, right? And there's a lot to unpack in them, I think.
You did also ask people why they don't trust the news. Some of the main reasons were the perception of biased and opinionated reporting, a lack of facts, and politicisation of newsrooms that was seen as having a political leaning, not enough transparency in how media operate, and specifically this government funding of journalism. Some respondents even commented that the media wasn't providing enough positive news and supporting positive change. I guess that, Greg, feeds into what you were just saying about there being a kind of a mega trend and a mood that it's very difficult for anyone to buck, big or small, but particularly institutional and established ones.
Yeah, absolutely. Journalists are messengers of bad, they carry bad news. And look, the complaint that newsrooms don't do good news is a very old complaint. That goes back to when I was a journalism cadet at 17 years old. There was always the question of why isn't there good news in the newspaper? And journalists have no problem answering that with there's so much bad news, there's no room for the good news. And also we don't necessarily need to make change around good news, do we? We need to make change when bad news appears, and that's why bad news predominates. And it's so important that that we hear about what the problems we face are as a society are. And it's not PR, right? We're not here to polish the buttons of the government. We're here to challenge them and to represent the public and all these things. And it's a messy, dirty game. And the public doesn't really like it, although they value it. So then you ask, do you trust them? And there's a whole lot of feelings come up for people who are news consumers, I think. But having said that, it is really important that we keep a close look on the top line. You know, it is falling. Trust is falling. It is a big issue. And even if it's falling parallel to the loss of trust in government or education or these other things that an increasingly polarised society is seeing as issues, even if it is part of that trend, we've still got to do something about it.
And Meria, when it comes to which sources people do use, the report notes TVNZ and Stuff were the main or most cited sources of news for the second year in a row, so tallying with the findings of last year's survey. Facebook, though, the third most important source for New Zealanders according to a survey. And interesting if we take some of the actual comments provided by some of the respondents. For example, this person who was age 45 to 54 says, I mostly look at the official news sources when someone links an article. So on their Facebook feed, presumably. Other than that, I like watching government stand-ups and get info straight from the source when possible. I mean, are there people who, like this individual, are getting news submitted by other people via the feeds they're following on social media and then actually seeking to get news and information from institutions rather than actual news media organisations and sort of putting the two together?
When the person says that, they go to social media or they go to Facebook and then they find a link, so that link takes them to the news source or perhaps to news organisations. When we talk about some institutions or watching, for example, press conference of the government, they don't understand that actually that's mediated by the television or radio quite often. So it is a mediated media. What comes to the social media use, I think we don't know enough that what people are doing there. So when they say that they use, for example, Facebook as a source of news, we don't know exactly what are they doing. Are they what news are they consuming? What content they seeing? Where are they going from there? So that is something we would need to understand a bit deeper and do some like focus groups or something to find out how they actually use and what do they actually see and what do they actually click.
Yeah, and another one, this is a respondent who was female, aged 55 to 64, New Zealand European ethnicity, saying, look, if you want local news, our Facebook community groups are fantastic. During the flood 2 weeks ago, she says, I was able to see photos and video of what was going on just down the road. This is faster than any news outlet. It's local and it's real. And we know that really is an area of increase, isn't it, Mary, where people are forming local news groups and sharing news and information, some of which will come from the likes of Stuff, TVNZ, RNZ, whatever. Or, I mean, it could be coming from just about anywhere and have any measure of reliability or lack of it attached to it.
Yeah, I think that comment also caught my eye because I think what they said about the purpose and function of those community groups, and I think they do fill some gap for people. They do find something from there what the main news media doesn't provide them, and perhaps so quickly. When it comes to the floods and whatever, I think the media did a brilliant job. The reporters were on the ground; they were reporting as fast as they could. There's overall, I think the reporting was excellent. But they do take me back to that, importance of the local reporting and, having those local reporters on the ground. When you mentioned Crux, for example, which is, functions or operates in Queenstown, Wanaka area, maybe, they fall for the trust, for example, wasn't so big because they are talking to their communities and they are in their communities and they're reporting other issues which are important to their local people. And maybe same goes with the Otago Daily Times, for example. They are independent. They are, in the regions. Perhaps people, feel that they are telling the stories which are important and closer to them. There's a proximity there.
One of the things in the report, incidentally, is you mentioned a Pew study in the US showing, adults under 30 pretty much don't distinguish in their levels of trust between social media and national news outlets, which is a bit of a worry. However, they really trust local news outlets. Among all age groups, more than 70% were prepared to say they trust those. Is that because you've maybe less suspicion because you think if it was going to be misleading, you'd know about it because you know what's going on locally, and somehow people feel more connected to and feel better about actual local news being prepped in their own community.
I think that's just spot on, Colin. I think that is not only quite right, I think it's a massively important issue in the whole discussion of trust. Having been both a national, if you like, level reporter and a local reporter myself, I know what it's like when you write a story about somebody and then you see them in the supermarket an hour after the newspaper comes out. There's a level of accountability, there's a level of localness, a level of you're not running and hiding behind the newsroom door once you've published the news. You're accountable for what you've written, but also you have local knowledge. While journalists move from newsroom to newsroom as their jobs change, there's still a sense at a local news level that they're one of us. And you know, the Otago Daily Times should be extremely pleased with its result. Because it's now, you know, among the most trusted news organisations in the country. But the ODT has sponsors the local rugby club and has its name right across the stand, and everybody sees it on television. And the ODT owns and runs a bunch of award-winning local papers. The ODT is in the same building it's been in since 18-something. It is part of the social fabric of Dunedin and Otago. That doesn't, mean it doesn't make mistakes or it can't fall into the same traps that all media can fall into. But what it does mean is that locals feel it's part of their social fabric. At a much more national level, staff, NZME, RNZ, TVNZ feel quite distant from you if you're sitting in your home in somewhere like the middle of the Waikato or something like that. Your local paper...
Well, they shouldn't do that way, Greg, because stuff publishes the Waikato Times and has done for more than 100 years.
But before Sinead Boucher bought stuff for $1, Fairfax closed 38 local papers in one day. So, yes, the Waikato Times is owned by Stuff, but it's a metropolitan. And perhaps my example of the Waikato wasn't as good as, say, somewhere in central Otago or something like that. But even within the suburbs of Auckland, people are feeling lost about the news in their immediate vicinity because while they were part of a multinational news brand, things like the North Shore Times and the Western Leader, arrived at your door and had stories about the problems in your community. So there are these Facebook groups where people go for that information that you were talking about, and as Mary said, it's massively important, and it's really a good possibly mix of Facebook local reporting and just citizens putting their stuff on the net. But it's not mediated, it's not verified, and I'm sure communities act in their own best interests in a crisis, and all the information about the floods was probably massively important and useful, but it's still not verified by a journalist. It's not mediated and given context. So we actually do need people to interpret social problems for us, and those are journalists.
And Maria, the ODT and its intense localness and Dunedin and in the south would be one reason why they felt confident enough in this past year to put up a paywall online. Another thing you survey every year is people's willingness to pay. Is that on the up in this latest survey?
It went up, I think, 1% from last year. We asked, are the people paying for example, online digital subscriptions, or are they financially supporting with the donations or memberships other news outlets? And so it was slightly up. What is interesting to me is that we sit now much higher than an international average. So 23% of the New Zealanders say that they are paying for some online news. And internationally, that's 17%. So that's encouraging to me. The uptick was also there that, people who trust the news more, those news, what they consume themselves, they trust more. So I think these go maybe in hand. And for me, that is a kind of positive sign. I kind of, go against what Greg said early on. That might be some inkling that maybe we're leveling out on this trust. Maybe, we're seeing in the bottom. I have nice feeling about that, but I don't know. Hopefully I'm not wrong next year.
we'll pull you back in next year. We will definitely run that and see if we've bottomed out or not.
I hope it's bottomed out, as Maria says. I actually don't think it probably has. But if it hasn't, then I think we worked out last year that there'll be no if it keeps falling at 3 to 5% a year, then by 2000 and late 20s, there's going to be no trust left. And I don't really think that's where we're going. And I think that what people say they trust and what they actually trust are two quite different things.
Yeah, and another question is whether they value it, because people would often say, asked about politics, do you trust politicians and political parties, the political process? Oh, no. But do you believe in democracy? Oh, yeah. So maybe it's a question of what they value in terms of their media. But one thing we must talk about, and now I've committed the terrible sin of burying the lead perhaps, but the starkest finding in the survey, one that I think other commentators have seized upon, is the issue of what's been called news avoidance. So the proportion of news consumers who say they avoid news often or sometimes. This has increased sharply across many countries, your report notes, but I mean these results for New Zealand are quite stark. Greg, what was the finding there? 69% of people say they often or sometimes avoid it. That's much higher than other countries, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Of course, surveys are always sort of temporally contextual, right? So this was, the week after the cyclone hit that this survey went out. I mean, cyclones, even for those of us who weren't very badly affected, are quite emotionally draining.
Yeah, whatever week you picked over the past
year,
I think,
exactly.
You probably had something pretty wretched in the headlines the way it's gone.
Yeah, exactly. So I think one of the reasons that we'll largely agree on around news avoidance is that it's to do with the anxiety that consuming the news creates or accelerates or sort of I think all of us avoid the news on certain days, don't we?
Well, that was my next question, because looking at that, you say I would answer yes to that question. On the weekends,
even journalists, right? Even journalists avoid the news.
But when you look at the Reuters, I think 46 countries they surveyed. There's something they picked out in the chart here. Australia, it's 41% answering the same question the same way, as opposed to 69 in New Zealand. Germany, 29%. Finland, just 20. I mean, that's.
The Finnish love their news.
Yeah, well, yes, Mary, you could speak to that directly, couldn't you?
Yes, I think Finland is still among the most the countries where the news is most trusted, and Finns consume the news, and I think there is that. But the newspapers also put on extremely high quality product, I think. But can I go back to the news avoidance, because there were a couple of things which I think are important in my mind. And of course, as we all agree that sometimes we just don't want to watch news. It's depressing for everyone sometimes. But what caught my eye was that when people say that the news is repetitive. And this comes to the point that there are these content sharing agreements in New Zealand in place between the news organizations like RNZ, as you know, the Herald stuff, spin-off, whatever. Same content seems to be appearing in the different platforms, and so the people see the same content across the different platforms, and they say that news is repetitive and it's boring.
But Greg, repetitive is one thing, and that's an understandable human reaction. But, I mean, actual news that is miserable and hard to take on board is another thing. And we had a mini experience of this, I think, back in 2014 when RNZ certainly and other news organisations encountered a bit of a slump. A lot of stuff surrounding...
Remember it well.
Seemed very interested in him, and then suddenly, and yes, the dirty politics, all of that. And people seemed to turn off the news. But, look, twinned up with that, I hear what Medi is saying, but there's also this parallel finding here. Those who are prepared to say they are highly interested in news, just 37% in New Zealand, as opposed to, let's go back to Finland, 67% in your native country. Again, Spain, 55, Argentina, 48, UK, 43. We're way below all of those. Why would people in New Zealand right now be saying they're much less highly interested in news than those countries?
We've seen restrictions, cuts, redundancies. We've seen newsrooms shrink by about 50% since the late 90s. So we've really lost a whole lot of journalists, and they're trying to cover the same number of issues without...
That wouldn't affect public interest in
Well,
news.
it might, because I think the comparison between Finland and New Zealand is fascinating, because Finland has still a much more sort of communitarian, less neoliberal, if you like, approach to life. And as a result of that, their news is much better funded. When I asked Maria, why is this newspaper in Finland so attractive to you, and I won't attempt its title, but it's the major daily in Helsinki. And she says that it's full of these really in-depth, interesting stories with social focus. And then we noticed that there's 14,500 journalists in Finland. And I'm sorry I don't know the exact figure, but I think in New Zealand it's 2,500. So it does actually speak to what you can offer people. And when you see journalists having the time and inclination to go deep into an issue and to represent how that issue impacts ordinary people. And I think in New Zealand we're rushing the news. And I'm not blaming journalists for that, because the same stuff has to be covered. With fewer resources, you're inevitably going to get a thinner coverage. And I think some people are going, well, I'm not into the news because, and frankly, Colin, I don't think we can underestimate the impact of the pandemic on how people were suddenly shocked by just how their normal lives could suddenly be disrupted. We don't blame journalists for the pandemic, but what we do have to put up with them in our living room giving us the daily death numbers. And so when people decide, do I want to turn the news on or not? I think actually at the moment life's so difficult and challenging, they don't want to hear it. But I do also think that we've ended up with a media that doesn't have the resources to do that stuff that uplifts the reader, that makes them super interested in the issue and feel informed and feel that there are possibilities of solutions and they want to get involved. And it's a speculation, but I think resources in New Zealand journalism are inadequate.
There's also, I think that, in Finland, the news organizations together run massive media literacy programs in the schools. They start to build up the interest in the news and the politics, etc., really in a young age. So the school kids already are learning about the media. I don't think we have those here. I think it's time to bring and do something about that.
I agree with that.
Although there is still, I guess, a huge appetite for news. The mainstream news sites such as Stuff and Herald are right up there with all websites, Trade Me, the whole lot that people like to use. So it makes me a little surprised that people were giving that response about not being as highly interested in news as people in other countries. But just to finish, interesting that the government had recognised in some way that there was less of this public interest journalism being done in depth, and for 3 years there was a program that's now coming to an end pretty much, the Public Interest Journalism Fund, which they copped criticism for. It's mentioned in your report that it was seen as something that could possibly sort of compromise the news. Last Thursday, the Broadcasting Minister sprang something of a surprise by introducing a substantial budget increase for RNZ, more than a further, it's almost $118 million over 4 years. The minister had talked about a strategy for the whole of the media and for New Zealanders, but this is just a funding announcement for RNZ. We still don't know what they really plan to do with TVNZ or other things. Do you want to see more from the government in terms of how they really plan to back the whole media?
There was a big problems with the Public Interest Journalism Fund in terms of trust, as you know, last year when the people said that we don't trust the media because government is bailing it out.
Yeah, turned us into the team of $55 million.
Oh, yeah. And I don't think that's absolutely not true. I think we need to see the support for the newsrooms in some level and all across the board. If we want to have a diverse voices and diversity of the media outlets, there has to be some kind of bigger supporting system. I don't know what the mechanism would be, but don't just think that it's Facebook and Google who will bail you out.
The minister did say we will have to reappraise the role of TVNZ. They will be talking about it in cabinet, seeing as it's not now going to be part of a not-for-profit public media entity. The chief executive resigned. We don't know whether they're going to change direction or not. Do you think that's something the government needs to tackle in short order?
I think the abandonment of the merger, and I'm sort of slightly disappointed it's become known as the merger, because it was the creation of a new entity. While it did have some problems, and I know the bill itself was highly criticised, I still think that New Zealand needs a central, publicly owned multimedia, public news organisation. And I think in countries where you see trust high, they have these things. I mean, the problem is that in New Zealand, you can't suggest things without being accused of being some kind of socialist. But I really do feel that New Zealanders would get on board with the, feeling an ownership of a significant public interest journalism body. And as much as I adore Radio New Zealand, we just have to look at the demographics of listeners to know that, part of the whole thing was to bring in younger and different, more diverse voices. And I still think we can do that. I think that the new funding for RNZ is super important, and it's great to hear. But
one thing, Greg, sorry to interrupt you, but one part of the funding announcement was $12 million sort of hypothecated to what was described as a new multimedia platform. So the minister actually said this: the investment will strengthen news and current affairs coverage through a free multimedia digital platform to reach new audiences, expand regional coverage to be truly national, and a new initiative to prioritise Māori and Pacific content and support RNZ with emergency communication. So all of those things. But do you think that means that the government seems to think we need a new one, we need a new RNZ or public multimedia platform to do this, to strengthen all these kinds of content and present it, or it just means beefing up the ones they have?
I'm not a marketing expert, right? But it feels like there's an opportunity to start a new sense of ownership in public media. To look at overseas, at the countries where trust in news is high, where media is strong, where there are thousands of journalists, not hundreds, and ask, what is it about those places that is so healthy in the media landscape? And I think we'll find that there's a sense of ownership of public media. And I'm not sure we have that in New Zealand yet.
Sorry to compare it to my home country, Finland. But people are paying the tax there for the broadcasting tax. They believe and feel the broadcaster belongs to them. And this is something we're lacking here. No offence, but
I think
none taken.
The idea of a broadcasting tax license or fee is a controversial one. But if you do look at places where they exist, there's a sense of emotional investment and actual financial investment from each household, rather than, is this what the government's spending our money on? Then it's given the status of what I think it should always have had: education, health, public media. We are paying for this because it's important. And then I think also that the issue of whether our young rangatahi in Aotearoa are adequately prepared for media as they become adults. What is the level of education around civics? Even the media studies teachers at high schools tell me that they largely tend to teach the Marvel movies because it's easier and kids aren't really interested in journalism. But high school teachers who do teach journalism also tell me that it's an incredible and transformative experience for young people. So we've got to get civics back into school. And when I said that to a friend who's a media teacher, I said something on social media about how important media literacy was, and he said there are 13 literacies competing for the attention of our children. And so it is a complex issue, right? But I do think that a sense of the public role of the media is almost at risk of being lost in New Zealand, and therefore we get the weaponizing of the term mainstream media is really problematic. It's become a negative instead of we own this. This is us. This is the voice that is inquiring into the issues that we face.
That was Dr. Greg Treadwell and Dr. Miriam Mililati from the AUT's Centre for Journalism, Media and Democracy, and they were the lead authors of the annual survey of Trust in News in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And you can find a link to their full report and the full survey and more of what Dr. Treadwell and Dr. Mililati had to say in the online version of the story. That's on the Mediawatch page of the RNZ website, our section of the RNZ app, or you'll find it in our podcast feed. Now, as you heard there, the survey found that 86% of respondents in New Zealand were concerned about fake news.
If you can just give it enough of that truthiness to make people share it, then it can take off, and before you know it, your ad revenue on your website's gone from $5 a week to 50 or 100 or whatever. So one of the motivations for fake news is financial.
Now, back in March 2018, two former editors in the US started an international service to identify outlets that were hosting and spreading misinformation. NewsGuard now provides credibility ratings and what it calls nutrition labels for significant news and information websites across the US, the UK, Canada, Germany, France, Austria and Italy. This month, Australia's Communications Minister Michelle Rowland announced that the regulator there would enact an enforceable industry code against online misinformation if the media industry didn't enforce its own. And the same week, NewsGuard announced it was going to expand into Australia and New Zealand.
Yeah, we have people in Sydney who are reviewing Australian and New Zealand sites, and we have people in all the countries in which we operate who have some experience in those criteria. That has turned out to be a powerful way to separate generally trustworthy sources of news from ones that consumers really should proceed with caution before relying upon.
Well, we'll report back on what they report back on our media later on Mediawatch. But for now, that's all we have for you on Mediawatch this weekend. We'll be back with more on the media after the 10 p.m. news next Wednesday night with midweek Mediawatch during nights. And then back again with more Mediawatch at the same time next weekend here on RNZ National.